This chapter is about learning. Learning is a process by which life experience causes changes in the behavior or thinking of an organism. There are several different types of learning, but we're going to focus on the two biggest types. These are also the two types of learning that are most difficult. The first is classical conditioning, which we'll talk about in this lecture, and the second type that we'll look at is operant conditioning, and we'll do that in another lecture. What's the difference between these two types of learning? In a nutshell, classical conditioning is learning about an association between two stimuli, and operant conditioning is learning about an association between a response and a stimulus. Well, what do we mean by that? So for classical conditioning, you're learning to associate two stimuli. For instance, a lot of people do not like to get shots because they're very painful. So if you take your child to a doctor's office, which is the first stimulus, and then he gets a painful injection, the second stimulus, what do you think will happen the next time you take your kid to the same doctor's office? Now, I don't have human children, but I do have dogs, and I can tell you that they know when we are driving to the veterinarian's office, and they are not happy about it, because every time they go to the veterinarian, they get very unpleasant things that happen to them. Operant conditioning is when you engage in some sort of behavior or a response, and it's followed by a consequence. So if you performed well in a swimming competition, which would be the behavior, swimming, and you got an award, that would be the consequence, then you're going to want to swim in additional competitions where you can get more awards. Ivan Pavlov was one of the most prominent figures in the history of psychology, but he wasn't even a psychologist. He was a Russian physiologist who in the late 1800s devoted his professional life to the study of the digestive system. He examined secretions made by various parts of the digestive tract, including saliva, which is produced in the mouth in order to start the digestive process. Pavlov was measuring the amount of saliva that dogs produce when food entered their mouths. And it's at this point that he made an accidental discovery. One day he walked into the lab, put on his lab coat, and started preparing for his experiments. He got all of the food containers ready to go and walked over to the dogs who were sitting there waiting for the experiments to start. And he noticed that all of the tubes, the test tubes that were collecting saliva, were already full. And he hadn't even started his experiment yet that day. At first, this problem really was frustrating and perplexing for Pavlov. How is it possible that he hasn't even started the experiment for the day and the dogs are already salivating? It was almost as if the dogs were anticipating food. And that sort of screwed up his research and probably made him a bit angry at the time, until he figured out that this was his most brilliant discovery. That is, the discovery of Pavlovian or classical conditioning, a form of learning in which animals or people make a connection between two stimuli that have occurred together such that one predicts the other. This was a very powerful discovery that he dedicated his life to after making it. Pavlov's classic experiment on salivating dogs included originally a neutral stimulus. Now, there's no real such thing as a neutral stimulus. If you suddenly pulled out something your dog had never seen before or made a sound that they never heard before, then they're going to orient to it. They might prick their ears up or cock their head to one side. So no stimulus is really neutral. But the point here is that when Pavlov originally rang a bell, that was not associated with food. So ringing a bell doesn't cause salivation. So in terms of salivation, this is a neutral stimulus. Instead, if you were to pull out a bowl of meat, an unconditioned stimulus, the dog would start salivating because meat naturally brings about salivation. So This is what we mean by a reflex. Classical conditioning works on reflexes. If I told you that I would give you $100,000 if I could put a bowl of food in front of you and you would not secrete any salivation, you wouldn't be able to do it. You can't control that. It's not a voluntary behavior, it's a reflex. So in this case, presenting food to a dog makes the dog salivate. What Pavlov did was to ring the bell and then present the meat to the dog. And he did this repeatedly. Rang a bell, presented meat, rang a bell, presented meat. And eventually what happened was the sound of the bell now caused salivation. Why? Because the sound of the bell predicted the arrival of food. Now, for those of you that have pets, whether it's a dog, a cat, a bird, or whatever, they probably are able to predict important events in their lives. For instance, there are certain cues. They could be time cues, like if you feed your dog at the same time every day, then as it gets closer and closer to that time, your dog's going to start getting agitated, maybe going over to where the food is stored. He might bark or do something because they know that food is coming. Now, one thing that my dogs are classically conditioned to is the sight and sound of me putting on my walking shoes. I have a very particular pair of walking shoes that I put on right before I take them out for a walk. And as soon as I start to put those shoes on, the dogs come running over with their tails wagging, and they're very excited because they know that when those shoes come out, a walk happens next. So I've classically conditioned them. So again, with the stimuli and responses in classical conditioning, we're pairing two stimuli, one that already elicits a response with a novel stimulus. And this can be any kind of unconditioned behavior. For instance, have you ever gone to the eye doctor and had that test for glaucoma where they puff air in your eye? I absolutely despise that particular test. It's very stressful to sit there and wait for them to puff the air in your eye. As soon as they sit me in that apparatus and hold the little lens thing up to my eye, I start blinking more than normal in anticipation of getting that unpleasant puff of air to the eye, as I know what's coming. It's really adaptive to respond in many cases ahead of time. Like if I yelled fire, it's better for you to take off running when I say the word fire really loud and emphatically than for the actual flames to be right in front of you. If you learn to respond in a timely fashion to a stimulus that predicts that something's coming, you're probably going to be better at surviving and reproducing and so on. So this is a very evolutionarily adaptive type of learning. If I made a really loud sudden noise, you would reflexively have a startle response. You might open your mouth and throw your hands up in the air. If there was some little sound that I made right before the loud noise, then eventually that little sound would come to cause a startle response in you. In fact, when I was in college and I was taking the upper division class that was all about learning and classical and operant conditioning, the teacher that I had at the time one day brought a gun to class and pointed it at the class and pulled the trigger and made a really loud noise in shooting the gun. Now, right before he shot the gun off, he said Pavlov. So he comes in one day, says Pavlov, points a gun at us, and then shoots. We were all under our desks, and I mean, everybody just dove to the ground. Oh my goodness, the guy must have snapped, we all thought. Maybe he didn't get tenure. Or maybe one of his articles was rejected for publication and the guys just lost it and we're all going down. I don't think any professor could possibly get away with doing that today. But back then, apparently, nobody thought anything of it. And it turned out to be the gun that you would use to start a race. It didn't have bullets. It just made a really loud noise that let people know it was time to start. But since the guy was a little nuts to begin with, we really thought that something terrible was about to happen. Now, after that experience, he went on with his lecture. We're all looking at each other like, what the heck? And a little while later, he said, Pavlov. Guess what happened to the class? Everybody started to go under their desk because they were pretty sure he was about to shoot off the gun again. And he eventually explained that it was a gun that you use for starting races, but by then we were all so agitated that it was hard to pay attention to the lecture. So this is the conditioned response. Normally when somebody says Pavlov, nothing really happens to anybody, but once you pair that with something that's very meaningful, that is a very loud noise and the sight of a gun, then the word itself becomes a conditioned stimulus. Now, acquisition is that period of initial learning of the connection between the unconditioned stimulus and the conditioned stimulus. So as you pair those stimuli together, you get a gradual increase in the association between those two, and the conditioned response is steadily increasing over time. As an example, I spend a bit of my free time working with people who have dogs that are either very anxious or who have aggression. And one thing that I witness in a lot of dogs is leash aggression. That is, some people have dogs that are okay when they're off their leash, but as soon as you put the leash on the dog, they lose their mind. And in some cases, those dogs will be very aggressive when passing by another dog. So if you're out walking your dog and you see another dog coming from the opposite direction, these dogs with this sort of leash-induced aggression will start to lunge and growl and snap the closer the other dog gets to them. So I have the client work on teaching the animal a different response when they see another dog. Instead of making them angry, we're going to teach the dog that another dog predicts food. Most of the time, food is the way to a dog's heart. Every once in a while, there'll be a dog that we use play or the ability to chase after a ball and retrieve it or something. But most dogs respond to food. So if every time a dog sees another dog, he gets a piece of steak, he's going to start hoping that he sees another dog. He's going to start anticipating seeing another dog because dogs no longer mean that something bad's happening, but instead it means that they're going to get steak. Now, it becomes very frustrating for me when a pet parent starts giving their dog steak at other times. If you're out walking and your dog is next to you and you say, "Well, you're being a good boy, here's a piece of steak." If you give them steak when there is no dog, then you've weakened that connection. You want the other dog to be the predictor of steak. You don't want leaves or fire hydrants or trees to predict steak. You want it to be just dogs. So you're going to have to give them the steak close in time. Immediately as they see the other dog is when the steak has to come out, and it has to only come out when they see another dog. That means that the stimuli need to be contiguous, and contiguity means that they have to occur together close in time, within a few seconds of each other, and contingency means that the CS, in this case the strange dog, must be highly predictive that the US, or steak, is coming. Once you have learned a behavior through classical conditioning, you can generalize the learning to new situations. As an example, Watson and Rayner were famous for doing studies with a baby that is known as Little Albert. And what they did with Little Albert was they taught him, through classical conditioning, to fear rats. Now, a little baby probably sees a rat as a neutral stimulus when you first put it in front of them. But they set a rat down in front of little Albert, and behind little Albert, one of them hit a gong with a mallet, making a really loud noise and scaring little Albert, who started crying. Then the next day when they stuck the rat in front of little Albert, he started crying because that rat had become predictive of that loud gong noise. And what they did after that was tested a variety of things that were similar to a rat to see if little Albert would start crying to those things. And he did in fact cry to a white rabbit. He cried when he saw a Santa Claus mask. He saw a cotton ball and lost his mind. It had seemed like he had generalized his learning to situations that were very similar to the original one. So white fuzzy things seemed to trigger little Albert. And in the photo on the top right, you see Watson with some kind of crazy mask on, and Rayner, his assistant, over there on the right, and poor little Albert reacting to that mask. Generalization sometimes helps us out because we can extend learning to new situations, but if that learning is a phobia, then this can be problematic for us because we're going to then develop phobias to a variety of different stimuli. Discrimination is when the conditioned response appears after the CS, but not to other CSs that are different. For instance, I had a client who had a dog with very severe separation anxiety. And so the client could not leave the house because the dog would go crazy, destroying the house, chewing up the trim around the door, ripping out the carpet. The dog would urinate and defecate in the house, and the whole 9 yards of separation anxiety. And we went through and looked at all of the things that the lady did before she left her house to see what the cues were that triggered the dog that she was leaving. And in fact, when she pulled out her tennis shoes, the dog was okay. But if she put on her work shoes, which for her job meant a classy pair of pumps, whenever she pulled out pumps or high heels, the dog would start to get agitated and start pacing because he knew she was going to be leaving the house. And this is something that's very commonly seen with dogs who have separation anxiety, that they can sort of discriminate between similar cues. They know that one means something completely different from the other. So this is discrimination. Extinction occurs when you present the CS without the US. So if you keep ringing the bell, the dog is going to stop salivating eventually because the bell is no longer predicting food. As an example, there was a point in my life when I had a very unpleasant experience getting my blood drawn, when the lady missed my vein with the needle that she was using, and the result was very painful, and I developed a phobia of getting my blood drawn. Over time, I have had doctors with I have a doctor now who's phlebotomist who takes my blood, is very, very gentle. So over time, I have sort of lost the fear, and it really isn't there, at least in the nurse that I'm used to. If you put somebody new in the situation, then it might trigger a recurrence of my fear. And a CR, a conditioned response that occurs after a time delay, but no additional learning, that's spontaneous recovery. Let's look at these laws of learning in a graph. So on the vertical axis is the strength of the conditioned response, or the CR, or how strong was the learning over time. And as you're pairing the CS plus the US over time, the salivation is getting more and more. So down here at the first day, there's very little saliva. By the end of training, the dog is drooling buckets whenever he hears the bell, let's say. Then you start presenting the bell without food, and it takes a while for the dog to learn that bell is no longer predicting food. Now, if you give him a little break, give him a day off, and then you put him back in the situation, even though there was no bell and food pairings here, you put him back in the situation, you're going to get an increase in the behavior before it goes away again. And that's spontaneous recovery. Let's say you had another pause right here, and then you tested the dog again. You're going to get a response that occurs maybe about here. That is, there's going to be a little bit spontaneous recovery, and then it's going to go down again. And if there was another pause, then the behavior would maybe come up to here. So each time there's a pause, there's going to be less and less of the behavior. So over time, it takes a while to completely unlearn. So here we are with extinction, when a previously conditioned response decreases in frequency and eventually disappears. Here is that gap where the dog gets a little break, and then spontaneous recovery is when the extinguished conditioned response reemerges after a little period of rest. So in the next lecture, we're going to talk about operant conditioning.